So we're about to start. My name is Alwaleed Alkhaja. I'm the head of open access at Qatar National Library. But I'm speaking here today, and before we introduce our keynote speaker, as I'm speaking as the one of the Forum Advisory Committee members. And what I would like to talk about is a report, a very preliminary report that we have done as Forum on the advancements of open science activities, something that we are very passionate about and we would like to continue and get more data on. So, so as a reminder, the Forum of Open Research in MENA, aims to support the advancements of open science policies and practices in research communities and institutions across the Arab region. And if we look at the road towards open science, it's quite long. We don't know where the different paths will take us, but we're very positive that we are on the right direction. And in the Arab states, where the focus of Forum will be, is that we believe there are many opportunities here. So we have in different countries the resources, the capability to play a pivotal role in the global transition towards more accessible, sustainable, and inclusive research and education models. What we also see is that the adoption of open access publishing is growing. And of course, as we heard yesterday, open research is not just open access publishing, it's much more. But this is a very positive indicator for us. Unfortunately, of course, as many other regions, we have challenges. The adoption of open science practices varies from one country to another. Of course, we are 22 different countries with different resources, different priorities. So the practices and how we adopt open science, of course, varies. And as we heard yesterday from different sessions, there's a clear need for localization of solutions. What works elsewhere may not work for us, or may not work from one country or another in the region. So we need to see what would, we need to focus more on the specific needs of the community. So I will be briefly talking about some of the results of the survey. But the survey was to start getting formed to better understand the landscape of open science in the region and to identify key priorities and challenges. The results. Now, of course, this is very preliminary and we need more data. We sent this on a very limited time period and we're going to be sending this again. We had 54 submissions from 24 different countries, 34 countries of which were in the Arab states. And our respondents basically are the stakeholders that we are trying to reach out. And of course, to get a solution that works for everybody, we have to engage with different stakeholders, researchers, librarians, policymakers, university admins, and others. Of course, the majority were researchers and librarians, but hopefully we can see in the end with more data what we get. But if we look at some of the questions we asked, does your institution have an open science or open access policy? Majority said yes. And even more positive, when we asked about the institution repository, a significant number said that they have it. We asked the question, does your institution promote and encourage open access publishing? And again, it's very positive. Most institutions or most respondents said yes. But when we asked the question, does the institution support open access publishing in the sense of providing funding for researchers to cover APCs or article processing charges? It's a bit different. So we get less. And these, of course, we need more data to get kind of a more better understanding of the region. But 51 respondents said they would welcome a policy that would make open the default operation model on a national level. And very positively, many of those who have responded said that they would be interested in having further discussions with Forum to explore more of the opportunities and key priorities. So this is what we're trying to do. We need to get more data. We'll send out the survey out again, and we'll do some working groups to identify what are the priorities. So if you're interested to provide your kind of insight, please send us an email at contact@forumforopenresearch.com, and we're planning to send out the survey again very soon to get more data. Now, with that, I would like to introduce our keynote for today. I'm very excited about this. I've always wanted to attend Professor Cameron's sessions, and I'm very privileged to be the one introducing him. So Professor Cameron Neylon is Professor of Research Communication at the Center of Culture and Technology at Curtin University, and well-known agitator for opening up the process of research. His current work focuses on how the cultures of research affect and change in research communications. He speaks regularly on issues of open science, including open access publications, open data, and open source, as well as the wider technical and social issues of applying the opportunities in the internet that the internet brings the practice of science. He was named as Spark Innovator in July 2010 for work in the Pantone Principles and was a co-author of the Altmetrics Manifesto and Principles of Open Scholarly Infrastructure. He's the proud recipient of the Blue Obelisk for contributions for open data. He writes regularly at his blog, Science in the Open. So with that, please welcome Professor Cameron for the keynote today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction. Let me just check that everything is working and you can hear me, and that the slides are showing properly. And with that, I will make a start. Sorry, just get that. Yeah. Great. So thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person for this talk, but I'm really excited to be part of this Forum of Open Research and the Forum Group. And I'll explain a little bit more about why I think this is particularly relevant, particularly interesting as I go through the talk. My topic today is to talk about words and to talk about declarations and manifestos and the stories we tell about what we're doing. So you've just heard that there are really forward motions on open science in the region, that there's real interest and enthusiasm, and that there are also challenges. And so what's the role of declarations and manifestos in addressing those things? And when do they work and how do they work? So, and I'll come to this later. I've been recently involved in working with a community on a declaration. And so the question arises, if we're talking about a declaration, we're talking about a set of words, is that better or more useful than actions? And so some of the responses, and these are real responses I've had to various things I've been involved in writing over the years, include, oh great, yet another declaration. Just what we needed. And then this is quite an interesting one. What is it about people writing white papers that they want to call them manifestos? So there was a period when many things were called manifestos. And many of those were actually proposals for change, proposals for other things, but we seemed to want to make the documents themselves sound more actionable or progressive. So is that an issue with the way we write, that we're trying to be too action-oriented? But one of the things that really comes up when you work on a document, on a story, on a manifesto, on a set of principles, a policy, is really this observation. So, enough talk. Surely it's time to do things now, to move forward. And that can be true. We can spend a lot of time talking, but what I want to argue in this talk is the importance of words and the value that words can have in different settings as part of an overall strategy for how we address and seek to make change. And the place I'd like to start that story is with a particular set of words that have resonated for me for a very long time, and I'm sure will resonate and be familiar to many people in the audience. And that's these words. An old tradition and a new technology have converged to make possible an unprecedented public good. This is a very well-crafted set of words. It's a very powerful set of words. It's the opening of a document, and it plays with a tension, which is common in many of these efforts, between trying to describe the possibilities of a new world and the important qualities of where we've come from. The words tradition, an old tradition and a new technology brought together are a really powerful part of what makes this document really quite foundational. And that document, I'm sure many of you recognise it, is the opening words, the opening sentence of the Budapest Open Access Initiative from 2002. So the Budapest Open Access Initiative was the first often seen of as three core documents of the open access movement. The Berlin Declaration, the Bethesda Declaration followed. As I put these slides together, I was trying to remember how the Berlin Declaration started. What were the words? Was there a phrase from the Bethesda Declaration that really stuck in my mind? And nothing had settled, had stayed with me in quite the same way as these words, written by Peter Suber in late 2001, and then eventually released on February 14th, Valentine's Day, 2002. And words that have brought us a long way towards the kind of enthusiasm and interest that the survey results you've just seen sort of suggest in a global context. Now, the Berlin Declaration and the Bethesda Declaration are still very important documents. They address different parts of the problem. In some ways, they attack some of the issues that needed to be addressed in the implementation of open access more incisively and in more detail. And that's the first thing that I really want to tease apart, is that there is this tension between soaring words that inspire, words that carry us forward with enthusiasm, and words that provide the clarity that we need sometimes in decision-making and implementation. This may be particularly true in English because of the way English has so many words for much the same thing. So in looking for precision, we often seem to have to trade poetry. And that is why the saying, again, in English, that we make plans in poetry but govern in prose. Is there another good example of this that I think will be familiar in this space? The terms used quite often in the European context, talking about open research in general, and particularly started from focus on data sharing, as open as possible, as closed as necessary. This is a great motivational text. It's a great way of framing what we're trying to do, our intent. But it's not very actionable. It's not actually a set of words that's very helpful in making decisions about what is possible and what is necessary in terms of the openness and closedness of any particular kind of research output. So when we're thinking about the texts that we're writing and the way in which we do them, I think it's important to think about the audience and the purpose. Sometimes our purpose is to inspire, to carry a group with us to bring a new community into a conversation. Sometimes the purpose is to be very precise about defining something, about being clear about how the implementation will work. So what is the purpose? What are the goals? And sometimes, and I think this is very much true of those three sort of formative declarations that are often pointed to, and you know, the BBB declarations, the three Bs. Sometimes it takes more than one text to achieve that goal, because those texts have to speak to different audiences, to different people, and to different goals. So what I want to do for the next sort of 15 or 20 minutes is to talk through some of the documents that I've been involved with. Not because these are the most important documents, but because I have the experience of the actual writing of them and the experience of the reception of them. And you've, in fact, heard in the introduction some of the names of some of those documents, and then we can sort of address which of these have been successful, which ones perhaps haven't been successful. And at the end, I really want to sort of draw a sense of why that is and what that means about the strategies we have for taking the open research agenda forward, both globally, but also in specific regional, national, and institutional contexts. So the first of those I'm going to mention is the patent principles, which is probably not something that many people have in fact heard of. It's something I was involved in writing. And one of the things I wanted to emphasize is these things take time. We often think of them being released on a specific date. But in practice, they can take months, in some cases even years, to write or to refine and to get to a point of release. And in this case, this was actually over 6 months between our initial writing and their eventual sort of release. Although we did, in fact, sort of talk about what we were doing as we were doing it, as we were refining things. So what are the Panton principles? The Panton principles were a set of principles where we argued about the specifics of how we should share data. And this was in 2009, 2010. And one thing that those of us involved in this observed was that there was an increasing amount of sharing, but it wasn't necessarily done in a way that made sure that that sharing could continue. And in particular, people were sharing things with strange licenses or no licenses in ways that actually made it really difficult to use them. And in particular, we saw a risk, which was as the importance of data sharing became more, as these data sets became bigger, and as we started to want to bring them together to make new data and reach new conclusions, that it would be really difficult to do that if we didn't have clarity of our legal rights to do that. So the patent principles are fundamentally about being clear about what you want in terms of the use of data that you're making available, using a recognized waiver or license that's appropriate for data, avoiding non-commercial and other restrictive clauses, particularly for public data, and this strong recommendation of trying to get data into the public domain in a form where there aren't legal restrictions on its use. Why is it called the Patent Principles? It's because this was actually, in, I guess, the British fashion, drafted in a pub in Cambridge, and were part of a bigger effort to discuss exactly how licensing could work. And I think Rufus Pollock caught a sense of what we were trying to achieve here. We were trying to make data integratable, to be able to bring it together. So imagine a world in which every article and every data set can be seamlessly stored, linked, and navigated through. And I remember, again, this was 2009, 2010. So for many disciplines, a relatively early period in data sharing. But of course, nearly a decade after the release of the human genome and all of the debates around the licensing and access that occurred there. This was part of a process arguing for the openness and availability of data. Were we successful? In many ways, no. if you look at the licensing of research data today, even research data that's intended to be publicly shared, it's not particularly coherent. It can be quite messy. The licensing is not always good. I have ended up, as a person who does research on large data sets that we bring together and integrate, struggling exactly with the fact that people have licensed them in ways that are not particularly helpful, and make it difficult for us to bring them together and reshare them. And that's a frustration. So in one sense, we were right about the problems we foresaw, but we still haven't resolved them. And that remains a challenge. We also posted this on our blogs. There wasn't any sort of thought about wordsmithing to any great extent. We didn't have a communications plan. We just posted it online in the way that at the time many of us thought was straightforward and simple, and that solved all the problems. And I guess that's interesting in terms of the next one I want to touch on, which is the Altmetrics Manifesto. I think this is one that probably more people have heard of. More people have had an interaction with, and this came a bit later. Now, I wasn't really deeply involved in writing this. It was really Jason Preem, who was the real driver behind the text of this. Paul Groth, Dario Taraborelli, and myself, I came on last. And yeah, we refined that text, but it was very much Jason's sort of focus on developing this idea that there was this broader set of communication channels on the internet. In the world of what social media is today, this feels very naive. It feels like we were, at the time, naive about the risks, but also in some ways about the opportunities. I think the other thing that's interesting about the Altmetrics Manifesto is that it's not about research evaluation. So people's association with Altmetrics today is primarily around the altmetric donut, the score that altmetric.com provides, perhaps in general about social media analytics and counts of views and usage and composition. But what the Altmetrics Manifesto was largely about was actually discovery and the ability to find the content that was relevant to us, to build communities around content that would allow us to discover, integrate, and work with it. And yes, to some extent, to ideally democratize the way in which evaluation was done. My motivation personally was very much around the idea that if there was a wider range of things being evaluated other than citations, that this would become a way of broadening the kinds of research that was valued and the way in which people valued research. Here, Jason had much more facility with the web tools and the sense of social media marketing. In that sense, there was more a sophisticated communications plan with the Altmetrics Manifesto. I think in some ways the wording and the wordsmithing is better. There was an attention on what that first sentence was actually saying and what that first paragraph was saying. And so in that sense, it was more sophisticated. It also arrived at a time when enough people were interested in what this social media thing might mean for the world and how it would work. Ironically, given my goals for the idea of widening the set of metrics that are involved and the availability of data that would allow us to look at research evaluation in new ways, it ended up being my most highly cited piece of work. And this number's actually significantly out of date now as well. I think it's up to a few thousand citations. But of course, one of the interesting things going on here is that I need to use Google Scholar to tell this because other sources of citation don't treat this as a citable work. So you're not going to find the Altmetrics Manifesto Web of Science, for instance. And yet at the same time, as I'll come to a little later, we were arguing about the need for community-owned infrastructures and systems. So there's a tension between all of these documents as well. And sometimes that's a productive tension. Sometimes it's just what was on the minds of people at the time. But these things are very much rooted in the time in which they're written. And again, that's true, I think, particularly of the Force 11 Manifesto. Again, it's in an early effort to really think about how scholarly communication could be different, how it might change in ways that would reach more people, be more effective, be more cost effective, and in particular to bring in, again, this greater diversity of objects, greater diversity of communication that would, at least in theory, enable us to communicate, validate, and curate research in a different way. The Force 11 Manifesto grew out of two meetings which were almost accidentally planned to be held in 2011. One in San Diego, at University of California, San Diego, and the other at the Dachstuhlschloss in Germany later that same year. And it was almost an accident that the two groups organising those meetings came together to coordinate what was going on. And out of that came a document, and the document's quite long, it has to be said. It's a document that you need to take some time to sit down with, but it was trying to cover a whole set of things. It wasn't just a manifesto, it wasn't just the declaration. It was a whole program of work for transforming research communication. FORCE stands for the Future of Research Communication and E-Scholarship. The E on the end was the contribution of the late David Schotten. And Force 11 was then intended to be a sort of sense of how that was going to play out over time in terms of the strength of the movement. The document itself, very much a scholarly document, very much focused on researchers and technologists and those interested in that aspect of it. And I think what's interesting about this for me is what grew out of this didn't really arise so much out of the document as out of the community. Sorry, wrong slide. And in particular, this is a FORCE conference from the pre-pandemic days. I think this was 2018 in Montreal, a group of 200 people. Recently, the Force 11 Scholarly Communications Institute and the Force 11 Conference were held at UCLA. And again, about 150 people, which again, post-2020, as you will be aware, the challenges of bringing people to an in-person meeting are significant in this day and age. But despite the challenges of the pandemic and the 10 or 15 years nearly that have passed, what's come out of that community and out of the motivations behind the community, which are in the document, but are not necessarily of the document, include things like contributions to the concept of FAIR, the Joint Declaration on Data Citation Principles, a whole series of really crucial documents, crucial planning and implementation documents that have driven the uptake of open research over time and over that decade or more. So here it's not so much the document itself as the people behind the document and the community that they build, and that community continuing over time, that those sort of core values and core systems remained in place. And then, and this is all in roughly a 5-year timeframe. The final one I want to talk about in this section is the principles of open scholarly infrastructure. So we go right back to the Panton principles. That was about the what as was the Altmetrics Manifesto. It was about arguing for a particular kind of change. The Force 11 Manifesto moves more to the how. How can this change be made? What technological possibilities are there? And the Principles of Open Scholarly Infrastructure was an effort to address a different part of the how, the question of what kinds of institutions and organisations can we trust? This was written slightly after the formation of ORCID, and its core motivation was for the three of us who authored it, myself, Jeffrey Belder, and Jennifer Lynn. We had a concept of a thing that we thought needed to be built. As it turned out, that thing never actually got built. And we thought, oh, no, this needs another organisation. And we'd sort of just been through the process of watching and in some cases being involved in the creation of ORCID itself. And honestly, we're at the point we really do not want to have to do that again. And if we have to do it again, we want to do it once and we want to do it right. What kind of organisation would hold our trust to be the kinds of thing that we think would really manage support for the long term, the open research agenda? And so what would that look like? And that was our thought process, was what kinds of organisations did we want to trust? What kinds of organisations did we want to work with, and what did we want to build? Again, this started with a blog post. It feels delightfully naive in some ways to look back and think we thought a single blog post would change the world, but sometimes they did. That's less true today. It's really hard to get the kind of reach that you used to be able to get with blogs and social media. But this was a set at its core of principles. And here, to a certain extent, while people liked what we'd written, and we wrote this sort of slightly polemic blog post, which maybe put people off the principles themselves, which were really the point we were trying to make. So it took some time before we saw the sort of adoption of these as a way of working. But what's happened in the meantime is 21 organisations at this point, depending exactly how you count them, have adopted this set of principles, this document, as a sort of management handbook or doctrine. And some of these principles are hard things to achieve. Some of them are things like sustainability. Some of them are things like providing all of the data that's important for an infrastructure, some of open source, and many other things which are challenging and difficult things. So as a set of principles, its focus is to create aspiration. But what's been exciting is that this group of organisations have come together to look at how they can take forward those principles and take them into the future. So here again, the document itself is useful and does seem to be of value to people. The three of us who wrote it don't feel like we've seen anything we got terribly wrong at this point. I think there are things we could have been more precise about, and we certainly could have worked harder on the wording of some of those things. But here is a community of organisations now trying to make it better and more fit for purpose for them. And that's how things preserve, because they've become part of the story that they're telling themselves. And that's an important part of this story as well. So then those are just examples. There are many other documents and manifestos and sets of principles that I could have mentioned or draw on. As I said, these are ones that I've been involved in, and so I have that experience of their reception and their writing. But what have they achieved, and what can we point to as what's worked and what's haven't? So if we take the BOAI, which I have to say I was not involved with, that first initial document in 2002, then we're talking about a period of over 20 years now, a shift from talking about open access to figuring out how to do it in reality and making it happen, a shift from open data and data sharing being something that happened in a very particular space in genomics and perhaps in astronomy, to something that's now the core of many disciplinary practices. A shift from print to online, which was easy to forget that in the late 90s, a lot of journals simply were not online, or if they were available online, were not available in a way that was necessarily widely accessible. We've had these shifts. We've had the development of social media, and perhaps it's now failure. We've had radical changes in the way scholarly communication works, and radical changes in the forms of organisation that run scholarly communication systems. Organisations like Crossref, like ORCID, like DataCite, that are now at the centre of these systems, and where increasingly the funders and supporters of the research system are demanding that role in governance. But at the same time, again, have these documents made a difference? They're sort of concurrent with a massive change. Certainly a massive change in levels of open access. It's actually quite challenging, I discovered preparing for this talk, to actually get a sense of what levels of open access actually were in 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I say that, I did some of those analyses. One of the things that's happened is that there's been a lot of work to actually make things published back in the early 2000s open access. So this graph would have looked a lot thinner in the earlier. These graphs are all taken from the UNESCO Open Science Outlook published late last year. The graph in the middle, the orange one, it's actually in some sense not important what these are, but this shows some different objects, the growth of sharing of software, and the growth of the use of identifiers on the right-hand side in the scholarly communication system. These are big shifts and big changes. And I don't know that any of these documents that I could point to any of them and say, you know, this was the change, this is the thing that led. So again, it's part of the story, part of what's changed, part of what's been happening over time has been to support the implementation, to help organise and coordinate the action of different people in different groups through these shared stories, through these shared narratives and documents that brought people together to solve problems together. And that was kind of where I'd left it. I hadn't really been involved in writing one of these documents for a while, since around 2015 when we released the Principles of Open Scholarly Infrastructure. It seemed like, in a sense, I'd done my dash on that, and that it really was time for action. But then in the last couple of years, I had a realisation, largely is driven by the thoughts of Ludo Waltman at CWTS talking about open research information. But there was a bigger picture here. So again, if we start from the BOAI and talk about that as the what, the Panson principles are the what, altmetrics and the Force 11 manifesto become the how, and the principles of open scholarly infrastructure talk about the how in terms of governance and organisational forms. But we perhaps hadn't got to the why. And I don't mean the why in the sense of why would we do this? Why do we want to do this? Why do we want open research? But the why of how is this in the interests of the organisations that have to invest and make an effort to make the change? Because that's the hard bit. That's in the introduction, as you heard, the contextual issues and challenges faced in the Middle East specifically are different, and the institutional forms and national contexts are different. And you need, therefore, the sets of incentives at the institution level as well as the kind of policy incentives that might drive individual practice. And I think there's two declarations and communities that have emerged recently that really start to address this. And I will talk about the one again that I've been involved with, but COARA and the agreement for reforming research assessment that underpins the community that is COARA is an example of thinking, where are the levers for change? And the levers for change are largely in research evaluation and assessment. How do we improve on research assessment to achieve the goals and the differences that we're looking for? And that's what COARA is focused on. It's very action-oriented, But the document itself is focused on these questions of the link between the incentives that come out of research evaluation systems and the way in which those can be linked to more progressive and open practices. And then the second, as I say, really driven in part by Luna Voltman's passion for finally pushing us out into a space and into a world where the information about research, the metadata, the systems, the availability of that knowledge of where the research is happening and by who and where and in what forms, led to the Barcelona Declaration, which I spent a little bit of time talking about. I know some of you heard Bianca Kramer talk earlier in the week about the Barcelona Declaration, so I won't spend that much time on it. But to put it in context, it's focused on open research information. And what we mean by that is metadata and information about research in a broad sense. So the information that underpins evaluation, the information that underpins strategy and decision-making, that underpins research integrity, testing, and all of those things. And so in our work on this year, we noted that our assessment of research institutions, and this speaks to COARA as well, is based on non-transparent evidence. So we need transparency in our assessment processes. We need to address the bias in the existing information sources against those regions, geographical regions, topics, areas that have not yet had the kind of attention, that are not as included in the more traditional data sources that we use to make decisions and drive evaluation. And ultimately that we're using closed data to assess the progress to open research, which seems the wrong way around. So the goal here is to shift that from a closed research information environment to an open research information environment to be able to deliver the aspirations of the open research agenda. But that's very sort of high level and vague. Let me make that much more concrete. This is a graph of metadata availability in Crossref, and on the bottom axis from left to right, we've got the percentage of journal articles by each publisher that have affiliation information available with them. So open metadata that lets us link an article to the organisation where that research was done. And then from top to bottom, there's the number of journal articles. So what's interesting about this graph is that it's not just the commercial players on the left-hand side who aren't making this data available because they want to make money out of it. And it's not just the open access and new publishers on the right who are making all of this data available because they're good people. There's actually a real mixture going on here, which is telling us more about the systems which publishers use. In particular, on this particular form of metadata, and I've told the people at PLOS this, they're fully aware of it, and I know exactly what the problem is. This is something that the Public Library of Science does very poorly. It's to do with the systems they use to manage submissions. It's not necessarily their fault, but it's not the highest priority that they've currently assigned in terms of something to fix. And I know this because this was a problem back when I worked at PLOS in 2015. And so the question is, how do we motivate organisations to make this available? We can't simply ask people to be nice because there are many priorities. There's lots of work to be done. How do we communicate what is important in terms of driving these changes? And part of the answer, to be blunt, is money. So the Barcelona Declaration was prepared by a group of 25 research information experts. We met in Barcelona and then published the declaration April 16th. One of the things that's interesting about the group that drafted the declaration is actually that almost none of those people had English as a first language. So it's the first time I've been really involved in drafting a document where we were working really hard to try and make it more internationally intelligible beyond authors who are usually Anglophone in origin in some ways. And this slide is now out of date because we've got nearly 100 organisations having signed the declaration and another 50 or so supporting organisations. What does it have in it? It has 4 commitments. The first is we want open research information to be the default for the information we use and produce collectively. And the second is really the meat, if you like, of the declaration. And so to go in a little more detail, what this really is focusing on is saying, this is something we expect for the services we pay for. When we have publishing agreements, we expect that the metadata that's generated as part of those publishing services will be made openly available. When we buy information systems, we expect to be able to export the data from those systems to make them available and to reuse them in standard form. So it's really about how to create the incentives so that we are aligned collectively on what is important in terms of this specific area of metadata. And then to support that, we need to support the sustainability of the infrastructures through which that data is shared, and we need to support collective action to make this happen. We worked quite hard to get specific organisations signed up. And the point I really want to make here is that we went through really thinking about the communications. We really thought about who we were trying to reach, what our goals were, and how we were going to communicate it. It's not an accident that I've got a set of slides and a slide format for this part of the talk, because that was one of the things we quite carefully did. We created these infographics where people with influence and prestige were amongst those people saying why this is important. If you're interested in supporting the Barcelona Declaration, then you can reach us at contact@barcelonadeclaration.org. But for the purposes of this talk, I just want to emphasize that difference, that approach in which really thinking about the communications, thinking about how it looks, how it feels, and making it look professional was a real part of what I think has been a significant success. The other sort of nice little piece of the story here is that we actually reused the website that was put together for the principles of open scholarly infrastructure. Because it was an open source website, we could reuse it. Although they probably look quite different, they're built on the same basis, which was actually quite a nice thing to be able to do. And again, illustrates the principles of openness and open data. So as I come to an end, what do we learn? What would I like you to be able to take away from this? I think one of the things that's really important is the way in which the qualities of communication and the environment in which we're doing this communication have changed. The beginning of my story, the Budapest Open Access Initiative burst into a space where the web was a new thing, where people were still largely working in print, largely communicating even through mail. Email was a thing and it was quite common, but it certainly wasn't universal. The web was certainly not something that people would use. The idea that a URL would appear on an advertisement wouldn't really exist for another 5 to 10 years. When we wrote the patent principles, we were writing for an audience that was online. We were writing for an imagined audience that was quite small. But even in the 6 months between that and the Altmetrics Manifesto, there was a sense of a growing audience of the power of social media and how it worked. Again, with the Force 11 Manifesto a little later again, it was for a particular audience, but that audience at that stage was online. The principles of open scholarly infrastructure were initially a blog post, a set of documents. The Barcelona Declaration, we worked very hard to get mainstream, conventional, old-fashioned, traditional media involved because it was important to reach the kinds of levels where people wouldn't be picking this up from some form of social media, be it LinkedIn or Twitter as was, or Mastodon or Blue Sky, or any of those that we had come to rely on. So that the environment changes. and the strategy matters. And I guess that's kind of the core point that come to the end. Communication strategy matters. What's the purpose of what you're trying to say? How does it work? What works is when the right audience picks it up and runs with it, whether that's an audience of enthusiasts and advocates or implementers and policymakers. And that there are many different ways and places to affect these changes. So try to find where the lever is that makes sense and where you can make a difference, and acting there is key. Build communities, because it's communities that take these things forward, and words matter. So everything is connected, and don't get discouraged, because sometimes the change you're making takes time to emerge. It's hard work trying to push these things forward. But if you don't try, nothing does change. And things move slowly. We only often find the critical step in retrospect. Here's an example of something I think works. It's just a tagline we use in our work at Koki, but to say that our goal is to change the stories that universities tell about themselves, put open knowledge at the heart of that narrative. So the core of this is storytelling. Tell stories that people want to be a part of. In the end, we are nothing more than the stories we tell about ourselves. We tell ourselves to ourselves and to others, and that others tell about us. It's the stories that take us forward and the stories that make change, whatever audiences they're trying to seek. And I will stop there and thank you for your time and attention.
Professor Cameron, that was amazing. It was very inspiring and lots of food for thought. I think many of us are inspired, and I do really wish you were with us today. I'm sure many of us would want to grab and speak with you in the coffee break. We have a couple of minutes, but I do hope that you join us next year for the forum. We have a couple of minutes before the coffee break, and I would like to open the floor for maybe 1 or 2 questions. If there's any from the audience. I mean, I do have questions of my own, but I have like 3 or 4, but I would like to see, there's a question in the back, Becky.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cameron. That was really interesting. My name is Becky Hill. I work at Taylor & Francis, and my question was really about, it was great to hear about the inception of these various initiatives and the impact of them. And they're also embedded in the scholarly communication system now. That I guess my question is about the bit in between inception and where we are now, and how you managed to keep momentum with these and some of the challenges you experienced or lessons you found.
That's an ongoing challenge. I think the key to that for me, sorry, I'm not too sure exactly whether I'm still sharing or something. Something's gone slightly odd on my computer, but hopefully this is all working. It's a challenge. I will note that many of the people who've been involved in these initiatives over the last 10 to 15 years have been exhausted and burnt out. I think there have been battles fought in which pushing people to exhaustion was part of the strategy of various players. So I think it's a really important thing if we want to build a kinder, more open world. I would go back to community. The thing that keeps me going in all of this is community and the people and how it works. And so that to me is the key. The sense that there are other people with you. You know, I know it's not. I don't think it's actually an African saying, whatever an African saying would be. But the thing of if you want to go far, go together. I think is the key. And otherwise, it's reminding yourself to look backwards and realise that while it often feels like change isn't happening, that often it is. It's just that you can't see it except in retrospect. You've got to. Small incremental change always feels like it's taking forever. But actually, when you look back and really think, oh no, but back there, I mean, for a long time, the statement that was going around was, we have 12% open access. And that was a common statement right through until about 2012. We've got a long way further than that. So yes, I think community working together yeah, trying to create a world where we don't burn everyone out would be useful.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Do you have any, we have, I think, 3 minutes. Maybe we have one more question from the audience. Okay, we're having, well, here you go. Hi again. Hi, Cameron, can you hear us?
Sorry, I believe so. Sorry, Zoom. I think Zoom decided I needed to update.
We're happy to have you back. We have a minute, so to kind of, before the break, I'll take extra 30 seconds for us. I have a very basic question. We've heard the kind of seen the journey through time of different kind of words, and you mentioned like the importance of the power of a word. We've heard manifestos, principles, and declaration. And if you could maybe tell us maybe what's the difference between them, just very briefly, because that's something I think the audience would benefit from. And maybe just a quick follow-up, if we are to do something in the region, what would be the best tool to do?
I think in a sense, so a set of principles is very much a set of aspirational things to reach for. I think that's a different kind of document, and it might well be that would be a great place to start because it can be built on what's contextually relevant. I think it's really important to start from a values-based approach. So if you're doing something that's bottom up in terms of what's relevant in the region for those communities, I think a set of principles based on a values process is really a great way to start. I'm not sure there's that much difference between a manifesto and a declaration. It's probably more to do with how radical you want to seem. Manifestos are usually an effort to propose radical change, whereas a declaration is often slightly more measured or conservative in tone. Again, that might be a choice. I think it's also a history thing that they're popular terms at different points. But I think something that really articulates principles is a really valuable place to start, and identifying what really matters in context, and working that up from the kinds of survey that you were talking about and the kinds of community organisation that represents. And form is a great place to build that kind of consensus on what matters and what the targets should be.
That sounds good. Thank you so much for the answer. And I wish we have more time. I mean, it was very enjoyable keynote, and I would like to thank you again, and for the audience, thank you, so. And we hope to see you. And so
Thank you.
Thank you so much.